So come Christmas, and this is under the direction of the Lord, give something to God's biological family. Be a blessing to Israel. Be a blessing to a Jewish person.
Kenneth Copeland Ministries and Eagle Mountain International Church invite you to a tour like no other. Join us May 25th through June 4th for our first ever Israel tour, an uncommon journey through the Holy Land. You'll experience a fresh revelation of Israel's past, its present, and its prophetic future. With your tour hosts, Pastors George and Terry Copeland Pearsons. We will sail the Sea of Galilee, visit Capernaum, Jesus' hometown ministry, take communion at the Garden Tomb, pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and be baptized in the Jordan River.
Most important issues that any government can deal with is how it's going to respond to Israel. Will we as a country bless Israel, or will we as a country hurt, harm, or curse Israel? It's a very big issue.
Where a person stands on Israel is so important, because if you're for Israel, you're not going to vote for a measure that's going to squeeze Israel dry, because the freest, most democratic state in the Middle East is Israel.
On this channel, we've spoke a lot about religion throughout the years. I used to be an atheist channel, primarily leftist atheist channel, not some sort of new atheist, but I often discuss things like Israel and why certain groups of Christians or even other religions love the state of Israel. Now, today we're going to be talking about why white evangelical Christians in the US really love Israel. So we're going to be talking about the history of the Christians and the Jews, and just the bit of irony about these guys really loving the state of Israel. Then we're going to be talking about the history of Christian Zionism and what these evangelicals believe and why they like Israel. And it probably won't surprise you that a lot of the reasons these guys like Israel are actually pretty racist and pretty awful, because a lot of them see Israel as a key to Armageddon. And to finish it off, I want to talk about how this influences their support for politicians. Now, I was looking at the Kenneth Copeland YouTube channel and I found a good roundtable of various people involved talking about Israel as a political issue. So we're going to take a look at that for the final part of the video. Regardless of what YouTube do, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the on Instagram and Twitter. And also u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. Thanks so much everyone for getting me to 30k last week. You've got the chocolate orange pyramid. Let's add another one on by getting to 35k in the near future. Also, for those of you who care, I have a second channel called The Tabernacle Extra, and that's where I post my archived live streams. At the moment, I'm streaming twice a week, so go subscribe to that if you want to. Now, I quickly just want to talk about the history of Christianity and Judaism. It's probably familiar to a lot of you, and growing up and being raised Catholic, I'm from an Irish background, so I went to Catholic school. I was even an altar server. My parents forced me to be one. I quit when I was about 14, I believe. But you grow up, if you're raised in this religion, hearing stories about Jerusalem, about Judea, about, Israel and God's love for the Israelites and stuff. So if you grow up in this tradition, Israel is quite normalized to you. Not that I really understood what Israel was as a country, as a young kid or anything. And we didn't actually really discuss that, which I guess that's, to my school's credit, that we never really tied all this stuff we learned about the region to the contemporary state of Israel. Now, I just find it ironic in all of this that Christians in this context we're going to look at really, say they love Israel, they love the Jewish people, when historically the main tormentor of the Jewish people have been Christians, and it has a very long history. They were expelled, from numerous countries, including England and France, often on allegations of, really satanic stuff. So basically, the state could seize their holdings. A lot of the time this happened in France. Then you have other situations like in Spain where they were forced to convert to Christianity, but they were never actually accepted as Christians because it was always said they had Jewish blood. A similar thing happened with the Muslim populations in Spain. And I've made videos, even in my last one about Anglo-Saxons, about how I believe this is the origins of modern day racism combined with the slave trade. But then you have other instances like the People's Crusade, which was part of the First Crusade, where they went to Hungary and killed Jews on the way to the Holy Land because they said the Jews had killed Jesus. And that goes all the way back to the famous biblical story where, Pontius Pilate asks, the crowd of Jewish people, asks them, who do you want to be free? Do you want Barabbas, this thief and murderer, or do you want Jesus, the so-called king of the Jews? They all chant, we want Barabbas. And of course, it's the Jewish priestly class that hand Jesus over to the Romans in the first place. So this is one of the key components of just historic anti-Semitism, is that the Jews killed Jesus, who is the Christian Messiah. And although anti-Semitism has evolved where you have, fascists hating them because of, Judeo-Bolshevism, essentially seeing communism as a front for the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And then, of course, you have Arab anti-Semitism, which was, catalyzed by the formation of the State of Israel and the various wars fought in the region. But a key thing for Christian anti-Semitism, including groups like the Nazis, was the death of Jesus. And the Christians who love Israel today are the types of people who in the past would believe this stuff. So it's a very ironic and interesting topic to look into. So now let's get into why, a lot of evangelical Christians in America, specifically white evangelicals, but not just white evangelicals, why they really love the country of Israel. So Mother Jones did a good article, and of course this was massive in the Trump administration, who really allowed a lot of Christian Zionists into, the top positions of the White House, including Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence. So it's titled, Evangelicals Love Donald Trump for Many Reasons, but one of them is especially terrifying. Now, I don't want to read the whole thing, but some interesting things in here. So it goes on to say, the enemies of Israel have unleashed a massive air attack on the Promised Land. Hundreds of fighter jets streak across the sky, but before Israel can be destroyed, fire rains from the heavens and the enemy jets explode in mid-air with no explanation. Hailstones the size of golf balls follow the fire, the ground shakes, birds pick clean the bodies of the fallen attackers, the enemy is vanquished without a single Israeli casualty, and the country is saved. These are some of the opening scenes of the best-selling 1995 book Left Behind, a novel of the Earth's last days by Jerry Jenkins and the late evangelical minister Tim LaHaye. But don't mistake this scenario for a mere action sequence. It's based on the war of Gog and Magog, a biblical conflict prophesied in the book of Ezekiel. In the Bible, Gog is the leader of Magog, a place in the far north that many evangelicals believe is in Russia. According to Ezekiel's prophecy, Gog will join with Persia, now Iran, and other Arab nations to attack a peaceful Israel like a cloud that covers the land. LaHaye, like many evangelicals, believe this battle would bring on the rapture, the end times event when God spirits away the good Christians to heaven before unleashing plague, sickness, and other horrors on the unbelievers remaining on earth. Meanwhile, the Antichrist reigns supreme. Now, just a quick note before we read some more of the article. I said I had a religious background. At university, we also learnt about the apocalypses, and this is something that we weren't really ever taught in Catholic school. I guess the Catholic Church kind of goes away from that stuff, while evangelicals play into it a lot more. But basically, it's, the end of days, when God raises up people into New Jerusalem, and it's always influenced by the politics of the time. So with the Jews and the Old Testament, it's normally influenced by things like the Babylonians and Persians in this instance, while in things like the New Testament, with the book of Daniel, it's influenced more by the Romans who historically persecuted the Jews and the early Christians as well. But basically, when we were looking through it, I always thought, this is really crazy stuff. Whoever wrote this must have been like eating some mushrooms or something. But then what you notice is that part of it, which we're going to get into a lot later, is in the Christian versions, is God saves his chosen people, which in the Christian version is the Christians, and the Jews will have the chance to convert, but if they don't convert, they'll be left behind, while the chosen people get rose up into New Jerusalem. So the article goes on to say, the story of Gog and Magog is central to the bloody eschatology long embraced by millions of American evangelicals. In recent years, end times have gained special political currency, as believers have seen any number of Middle Eastern conflicts as fulfilling Ezekiel's prophecy. Notably, the US invasion of Iraq and the war in Syria, Gog and Magog took on fresh relevance. Recently, this has taken the shape of Iran. Now, evangelicals are against the Iran peace deal because not only is it appeasing a country that threatens Israel, a lot of evangelicals actually want Iran and Israel to go to war because they believe the, Gog and Magog scenario is basically prophesizing this war with Iran. So they want this war to happen. And that's why it was so scary that all these people who believe this stuff were in the Trump administration. So the article going on to say, Iran has a big part to play in biblical history, says religious historian Diana Butler Bass, who grew up in an evangelical church and wrote her PhD on American fundamentalism. There are these particular prophecies from Ezekiel where there is talk of a war that will happen at a very important moment in Israel's history. And the war is going to kick off the end times. People in this prophetic community believe Iran is going to be one of these aggressors. And Bass thought this worldview was actually central to the Trump administration's foreign policy. So she went on to say, when Iran gets into the news, especially with anything to do with war, it's sort of a prophetic dog whistle to evangelicals. They will support anything that seems to edge the world towards this conflagration. They don't necessarily want violence, but they're eager for Christ to return, and they think this war with Iran and Israel has to happen for their larger hopes to pass. So just going into all this a bit more, a good article by Vox in 2018 called "This is Why Evangelicals Love Trump's Israel Policy." And they spoke to Elizabeth Old-Mixon, who was a politics professor at the University of North Texas. So she's describing evangelicals here, and she says, these are folks who believe that there will be a millennium in the future, a golden age where Christ reigns on earth, and they believe that before Christ will return, there will be a tribulation where Christ defeats evil, there will be natural disasters and war, and perhaps an antichrist. The book of Revelations notes, then at the end of that period, the people of the Mosaic covenant, including the Jews, will convert. Then after their conversion, the great millennium starts. This is a movement in Christianity that's old as Christianity itself. You have this group of people looking around for signs of the end time, and in the 20th century when Israel was founded, this was a major sign. This was electrifying for the community because the gathering of all Jews in exile to the Holy Land is a prerequisite for all these events unfolding. So for the subset of evangelicals in the 20th century, support for Israel became a really, really important political position. So the tenet of Christian Zionism is that God's promise of the Holy Land to the Jews is eternal. It's not just something in antiquity. When we talk about the Holy Land, God's promise of the Holy Land, we're talking about real estate on both sides of the Jordan River. So the sense of a greater Israel and expansionism is really important to this community. Jerusalem is just central to that. It's viewed as a historical and biblical capital. So keep this particular passage in mind when we talk about the politics section, because it explains why they're not only pro-Israel, they're extremely anti-Palestine and anti-Palestinians having any claim to Jerusalem or any claim to the land they see as, greater biblical Israel. Now, I find it very ironic that these types of people who believe this stuff are often throwing around, anti-Semitism accusations at people who don't unwaveringly support all of the Israeli government's actions. And it happens a lot in America. And it's why you can't often appease these people with your Israel policy, because they want this extremely hardline policy. Like I said, they don't want a two-state solution. They don't care about Palestinian rights. But then it's also ironic that the only thing they see the Jews as good for is, triggering Armageddon and starting this holy war. And like I said before, in many interpretations, the Jews will be asked to convert on the final days. But if they don't, they will also perish. Now, a lot of Christian fundamentalists want the Jews to convert now, because they believe if you convert now, you're going to help bring about the end times quicker. And we've talked about Christians doing that throughout history. Now, I just want to play you a clip of this guy called Ward Simpson, who's going on a big rant saying that, the Jews need to basically wake up and accept the Messiah Jesus, because that's how we get him to come back to earth again.
We're asking you to sow into the preaching of the gospel in Hebrew to the Jewish people. Jesus said he's not coming back again until his people accept him. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Friends, we have a situation. You want to see the great revival? It begins with the Jewish people's eyes being opened. How will their eyes be opened? How long will it be before the eyes of his people are opened? But if you believe Jesus' words when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes to the Father but through me, then we've got a problem. And our brothers, our sisters, they don't know him. They reject him. They still make fun of him. 2,000 years ago, friends, peace was there at their door, but they rejected him.
Now, it's strange these guys claim to love the Jews and love Israel above all else, but at the same time see them as a sort of disposable, tool to get their own ends, and they really want to force conversion on them, just like I said, that Christians used to do back in the past. This all seems very, very insane, doesn't it? And like I said, I grew up as, an English-Irish Catholic, and we were never talking about the end times in religious school or religious studies. We just never even mentioned it. We never even believed this stuff. In my mind and what we were taught, when you die, you go to heaven. And that's just it. And I don't remember ever being scared about Armageddon. No one ever spoke to me about Israel and how we got to support Israel no matter what, so we can hopefully one day see a war with Iran that kicks off the end times. None of this stuff was ever taught to me growing up Catholic. And I do think it's very ironic that we seem to treat these people, Christian Zionists and Christian fundamentalists, in a lot less extreme way than we view Islamic fundamentalists, despite them both wanting, similar things and having very hardline policies and everything. But now I want to get into how these evangelicals and their beliefs about Israel influence their politics of Israel. So like I said, I was watching some Kenneth Copeland ministries, and I came across a roundtable where these people talked about how you decide what you support in terms of politics, and they keep saying Israel is one of the most important issues for just the whole world, because we all have a connection to it, and it's important for all these Christians because this is how the Messiah returns, this is how we get Judgment Day, and this is how we get New Jerusalem. And our understanding of Israel's foreign policy is dictated by the Bible. So this may be quite long, but I want to show you basically all their points before I dissect them.
So we see right away how important it is that we as a nation support Israel, and how in administrations in the past there has not been support for Israel. We must vote for politicians who stand for Israel.
Every nation also has a relationship with Israel, because Matthew 25 says all nations will be called to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and there Jesus will be on his throne, and he separates the nations, the people, but the nations, for the sheep and the goat. And on what basis? How they treated Zion. So our nation has been blessed because we have blessed Israel, but as we as a nation turn against Israel, then we receive repercussions.
And America has had a long record. Now, I think the dividing line in what we'll look for with politicians is where they are on the two-state solution. Because that two-state solution says, Israel, give up your land to the Palestinians. No,
and divide Jerusalem.
And divide Jerusalem.
And demand that you divide Jerusalem.
And that's a problem, because, and I'll just say it real blunt. You're surrounded by about 23 other Arabic nations around Israel. Israel is, I think, 1/6 of 1% of the land in the region. All the other nations can give the Palestinians as much land as they want. They don't want other land. They want Israel's land.
That's all it is.
That's all it is.
It's always
and so
been
if a politician says, well, Palestinians need to have land from Israel, sorry, you have just stood against Israel, and God's not going to bless you.
A lot of people in the United States Congress who say, I'm for Israel, they're for Israel, and yet they voted for the Iran agreement. And Iran has said over and over and over, their goal is to annihilate Israel. So I think when David said, okay, how are you going to test whether a politician is pro-Israel or not?
That's
because they're going to say it. That's one way that you test it. The goal has always been from Satan to cut Israel back, hurt this nation. You cannot touch his people. You cannot touch his land. You cannot touch Jerusalem. Why? Because God gave a people and a land to bless the nations. And so we need to keep that blessing there, and that's why we are blessed. Voting in your city, in your county, in your state, where a person stands on Israel is so important, because if you're for Israel, you're not going to vote for a measure that's going to squeeze Israel dry, because the freest most democratic state in the Middle East is Israel. If you look at all the Arab nations, we're not saying God hates Arabs, but what we're saying is that if you want to talk about freedom, if you're a woman in the Middle East, you want to be in Israel. There is no other place where they are freer. So we could go on a number of different levels looking at Israel and what they've done right, what they've done wrong. But I will tell you, it has profound impact on these local and state races.
And let me add to it, the fact that we're pro-Israel, pro-Zionist doesn't mean we think Israel's done everything right.
Right.
God spanks his own kids. I mean, he spanked Israel how many times?
Amen.
But it doesn't change the fact, you know, you come after my kid, I'm going to have to take you on. That doesn't mean my kid's right all the time, but I'm not going to let you take my kid down.
Is to bring a pro-Israel perspective, because a lot of lies are told at the United Nations. And a couple months ago, 6 resolutions were passed right after the 70th anniversary of the United Nations legally creating a space for the Jewish state to be reborn. They passed 6 anti-Israel resolutions.
There have been more resolutions condemning Israel than all the other nations
combined. And that's every year.
It's an anti-God thinking that exists at the UN, and anything that God's got his hand on, they're going to be against, and that's why they're against marriage and life and everything else. Right. But and so on the state level, BDS is key. On the national level, that 2-state solution, if you're voting for a congressman or senator, where they are, oh no, Israel's got to give up the land to Palestine.
No.
God says in Joel, if you give up the land, I will not bless those who cause Israel.
And let's have been met. They reject it. Why? They want a one-state solution.
That's right.
The one-state solution means they want it all. They were offered land. They've rejected land. Why? Because they have an irrational hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And so let's remember, even if, let's say, the Arabs got what they wanted and they got 100% of that land, they still wouldn't be happy, because they won't be happy as long as there are Jews who walk on the face of the earth. It's an irrational hatred that is anti-God.
So I want to touch on some smaller issues before getting into things like the 2-state solution and like women's rights. But I find it interesting how they think any supposed bias at the UN or from more liberal politicians is because of an anti-God agenda. Now, they don't say anti-Semitism or people being anti-Israel for, you know, the awful things they've often done throughout their history. They say anti-God. I find that very curious, because most countries are religious and have gods. Most people in the world who are religious actually believe in the same God. I don't think most members of the UN, with all, you know, the Muslim countries and Christian countries that make up the UN, are anti-God. The Abrahamic God is their God as well. Now, they're also talking about women's rights and how Israel has better women's rights than the rest of the Middle East. I find this very ironic and hilarious, because these evangelical Christians are some of the most conservative people in America who aren't very concerned with women's rights. And I guess they can maybe claim some sort of superiority over hardline Islamic countries where, you know, for example, Saudi Arabia, women couldn't drive until recently. You have to cover up with, you know, a niqab or a burqa in certain Islamic countries. But at the end of the day, you don't care about women's rights either. So I find that pretty hilarious. You're pretending like Israel's a beacon for women's rights in the Middle East, because of course that's one of your priorities. It reminds me when Ben Shapiro said leftists and liberals should support war with Iran because we care about gay rights and women's rights. So that means we should support an invasion against a country that doesn't really value those things. But then also lots of gay people and women would die who come from Iran. I don't really understand the logic there. So the 3 things I want to talk about is BDS, the Iran nuclear deal, and the 2-state solution. So let's start with the 2-state solution. So they're saying that the Arabs were offered the 2-state solution loads of times and they never ever wanted it after, you know, the foundation of the state of Israel. And that basically they would never be happy anyway. If there was a 2-state solution, they would always want more. They were never willing to compromise. Of course, if you know your history about the, you know, the region, and particularly in the 1990s, there was genuine willingness to compromise. At first, there wasn't, and that's what you see with the numerous wars between Israel and Egypt and Syria. But when they accepted the reality of the Israeli state, because it was far too militarily powerful and it had the backing of the biggest world military powers, they were seeking compromise. But then what happened, if you know your, Israel-Palestine history, is that the more moderate Palestinians and the Israelis, it came to a bit of a deadlock. And a lot of the Palestinians, especially in places like Gaza, felt like these moderate Palestinians were selling them out to Israel, selling them out to the West. And that's why they elected Hamas in their elections. I think it was in 2006. And you even had Christian Palestinians voting for Hamas because they thought these were the only people who were willing to stand up for Palestinian rights. So like most things, it's complicated. You have certain groups of Palestinians and Arabs who wouldn't compromise. You also have a large movement, especially back in the day, of Palestinians and Arabs who would compromise. But they reject this entirely. When they said, God promised the Israelites this territory, they think Israel have the total right to the biblical version of their country. So that means expand it even more than what it is. So they see things as a 6-day war as something that was good because the Israelis took way more territory for themselves before giving some back. But that's why they like Israeli settler colonialism, where they constantly expand their territories into more hostile Arab and Palestinian places. And this is why these guys love Trump so much, because Trump backed Netanyahu, he backed these settlements, Jared Kushner's family has investments in these settlements, and for these guys, everything like that is a step to the end times. So the more settlements, the more expansion, the more land claimed by the Israeli state is helpful because you're reclaiming the land God promised you, and hopefully, but little by little, we are getting there. We're getting to the end times. Jesus will come back and will be lifted up into New Jerusalem. Now, discussing the BDS movement, of course, you get numerous politicians supporting this, but it's far less common in the United States than it is in the UK, for example. It's quite a common thing at universities. A lot of politicians do have their support for it. They're saying anyone who shows their support for this, you shouldn't vote for them at all. You shouldn't allow them to power. Israel is one of the most important issues in American politics. You cannot allow anyone to hurt them financially. And of course, I found it very telling in this whole discussion which I watched. They gloss over the bad things Israel does. They say, Israel's not perfect, but they barely detail what they've done. But they act like, because of the biblical prophecy and everything like that, and because of things like maybe Israel's a bit more liberal than some Arab countries, that it's something you should support unequivocally. So, anyone who supports BDS is, an anti-Christian, for example. And they're trying to have this monopoly on being a Christian. So I'm sure these guys think that liberal and leftist Christians who support BDS, who support Palestinian rights, aren't actually Christians. I would actually be interested to get their opinion on what they think of Christian Palestinians who voted for Hamas. And just with the BDS thing, I want to outline that there's a lot of talk of the Israeli lobby in the United States, but we don't talk as much about the evangelical Christian lobby doing the work of, of an Israeli lobby by lobbying all these politicians to have a very hardline stance on Israel. For example, all these Republican politicians, we maybe think Israel are really influencing them by, paying them money for their campaigns and lobbying them and stuff. But I guess with the right wing in particular, we should talk more about the evangelical groups that will do this for them. And that's why Israel often courts these evangelical groups, regardless of how awful their kind of views are on Jewish people and Israel in general, because they know the evangelicals will get them hardline support for, expansionism and their foreign policy against countries like Iran. And I probably play this already, but of course there's a massive tourism industry in Israel of evangelical Christians from the United States coming on massive tours to visit all the biblical sites. To finish off with the political side, the Iran deal is something that all these people really didn't support. Now, on the surface, they make it seem like, why would we have a peace deal with a country that has shown it is so hostile to Israel? Like, why would we accept peace with them? They deserve to be punished. We shouldn't really concede to them. We shouldn't sign this deal where the US releases the funds they've been, sanctioning the Iranians for. But what's not being said, and it is kind of sinister, is that these guys do not want peace in the Middle East. They do not want peace between Israel and Iran because of the Gog and Magog stuff. And they believe Iran is this country that is going to trigger the end times. So a massive war between Israel and Iran is actually something these guys want. And that's why they don't want peace with Iran. They frame it as something different, but the sinister motivation is they want this war to trigger the end times and the return of Jesus Christ. And even more sinister is that this attitude was driving the foreign policy of the Trump administration. You had Mike Pompeo, you had Mike Pence, two of the key people in that administration having a worldview where a huge war, where loads of Iranians and Israeli Jews and generally people in the region will suffer and die because you believe in some nonsensical prophecy from an ancient religion, which is, goes back to like 3,500 years ago. It's totally insane, but somehow the mullahs and the Ayatollah are, at odds with reality, but Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence are totally rational actors who we should take very seriously and believe have a really sophisticated political strategy for dealing with the Middle East based on the realities of it, like the known world. Whereas in reality, they base their foreign policy on complete fantasy. But to sum up, these evangelicals don't care about Jewish people. They don't care about the state of Israel. Generally, they don't care about the health of their citizens. They don't care about peace in Israel at all. Peace with their neighbors, peace with the Palestinians, peace with countries like Lebanon. They see the Jewish Israelis as a tool. Now, they need them to convert to Christianity in some instances, but at the very least, they need Israel and Iran to fight to fulfill this, biblical prophecy. And in many of the Christian versions, the Jews have to convert, but if they don't, they die with everyone else. Isn't that just a lovely prophecy? Not totally racist, not a totally horrible view of Jews and what Christians have done to Jews about trying to make them convert to meet these ends and stuff. It's a horrible history and a horrible legacy. And because of the cynical side of global politics, the hard right in Israel, represented by Netanyahu, caught this stuff because it helps with their foreign policy aims. It helps with their national security. It helps with them growing more power because it helps get them deeper in bed with the Americans. So these white evangelicals are not thinking of the future of the world. They're not thinking of the next 100, 200 years. They're not thinking about a sustainable peace between Israel and Palestine and Israel and the Arab world. They're literally thinking about what is the quickest way we can start Armageddon, and that is our political positions in regards to Israel. How quick can we use them to start the end times? Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the description. If you want to follow me on social media, at The Tabernacle, Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join our communities, come look at our Discord and the subreddit, and that is all in the description. Subscribe to the second channel. If you like my work, please support me on Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.